I can't remember the year I met Makino-san, but it's edging up towards 2 decades now. And it was through an introduction from Aaron Giroux. And when I went to his house and we started talking, we immediately hit it off. And not surprisingly, one reason is we had very similar intellectual preoccupations, particularly documentary and theories around documentary. But at the same time, there was more to our relationship as well. And I want to tell you a story, since I think it's illustrative of both another kind of connection we shared and maybe something about our relationship too. So once we went to Kyoto together to a conference that was connected to a festival. And we even roomed together in the hotel, save some money. And he snores. So I didn't sleep much. But one of the things we did in addition to this conference was take a little tour of Kyoto to a couple of libraries and shops that he had yet to visit. And Aaron, you might have even been on this junket, right? We went out to some maybe prefectural library on the edge of town that he'd heard had a whole bunch of chirashi from pre-war movie theaters, and so we had to go check that out. So it was wonderful just to tag along and hear him talk to the librarians and muscle his way in to figure out what they had and all that. But along the way, both to and from and every day that we were there, he would see used bookstores, and everything stopped, ground to a halt. You know, we had to stop whatever we were doing, go to that store. And if we didn't go in, we had to go back later. And over the course of the trip, he kept buying more and more books. It was insane, you know? And actually, none of them had anything to do with film. They were all to supplement areas of film. You know, it was like this base in philosophy and history and literature to support the main collection, the main act. And anyways, by the end of that trip, I was his porter. And we had a suitcase worth of books, and now they're here. In any case, I also share his love of book and of paper, and both of us, we love the feel, we love that smell, and we love the hunt too, and also the possession, you know, taking it home, writing your name in it, finding the right spot on a shelf and sliding it in, right? And so this was the basis of our relationship, I think. And so today I really should be presenting some new research to you. But actually the stuff I'm really excited about right now is very visual, and Makino is all about text. And so I've decided to go back to an essay that is in Cinema Babel, and has been anthologized a couple times for documentary books and for a translation reader, but maybe a lot of you haven't actually read it. So I'm hoping you haven't, and if you have, just bear with me. But I want to do it partly because, first of all, it would not have been possible without Makino and his collection. And second of all, as you'll learn, a piece of this project is in the collection as well. So, this is what I want to talk about. And the other reason I wanted to do this is, I mean, we're sitting on top of the collection, so we might as well do some show and tell. This is Paul Rotha's documentary film. It is a 1935 book from England, and it became one of the most powerful pieces of film criticism and theory that made its way to late 30s Japan. I mean, if you open any book on Japanese documentary, Rotha's theory is singled out as one of the most influential bodies of thought in Japanese film. Now, as we've learned last night and today, many or most of the big Western theorists from Munsterberg to Eisenstein got translated very, very swiftly. It could be, however, that none of them were as fiercely contested and debated as Rotha. It arrived in the late 1930s, and this was a very opportune moment because, of course, Japan was escalating the invasion of Japan. On the home front, the government was ensured that the war was reaching into the daily lives of people. They were drawing on young men for cannon fodder, increasingly controlling appropriate behavior. There was police pressure, including mass arrests, imprisonment, and occasionally torture on the noisy left, which essentially fell apart, and people either did an about-face or went underground by mid-decade. And at the very same time, the government was putting all these strictures on filmmaking, culminating with the 1939 film law, which mandated the screening of documentary films, which were called bunkaeiga at the time, or culture films. So, along with just the pressures of having a war out there on the continent, that legislation propelled Rotha's book into the public discourse. And documentary itself achieved a level of prestige comparable to the fiction film, and maybe a level of prestige that it's never enjoyed anywhere in the world at any time. So in this atmosphere, Rotha's book, and especially the 1938 translation, which is right here, electrified the film world. Now, I just want you to look at this thing, and I brought this to help. So this is Bunkaeigaron. This is the Rotha book, and what's striking to me about this is look at that slipcase. It's just beautiful. I mean, this is a project that was put together with love, you know, and the whole book is it's a beautiful book. And once it came out, it was afforded this incredible authoritative respect. And this interest in the discussions about it eventually filtered into filmmaking practice itself, allowing Rotha to leave a mark on the history of Japanese cinema that, you know, is pretty unusual to see this, the extent to which a theorist puts his mark on practice. Now, why Rotha? You might ask, because actually people in documentary studies in the West actually don't pay that much attention to him anymore. Very few people talk about him. They talk about John Grierson instead. But I think one reason is simply that Rotha's book appealed equally to the entire political spectrum at the time, with all the debate participants claiming him to different kinds of ends. And so what I want to do is examine precisely this struggle over meaning at various levels and root out the most important issues by looking at an arena that's maybe less obvious to us, and that is the media through which Rotha's thought came to be known in the first place, and that's translation. So consider one very simple example from the book. This 1938 edition mistranslates the term workers' revolution as Rodosha Katsudo, or workers' activities. Now, later, when it was republished in the post-war, and this is another measure of the respect Rotha got. This is a 1960 version. This is a 1976 version. There's even another one after this. in this version, you can read that same section and find Rodosha Kakume, or revolution. So, I mean, the reason is obvious, right? That revolution was a dangerous term to use in 1939. It would, even if you tried to put it in the book, it would just never pass censorship. So they just swapped it. But while there are many examples of this throughout the book, an analysis of that kind of simple and probably intentional mistranslation only gets us so far. And that's because first, as the example above, there were as this example suggests, there were entire communities of readers out there that were forced to really kind of conceal their real relationship to this book. And second, because as it soon became known, the command of English by this translator was less than perfect. She actually didn't know English that well. And it became one of the issues in the debates around the book. I think we've got to dig much further into this issue of translation to appreciate the complexity of the discourses circulating around Rotha's text once it arrives in Japan. First of all, very few filmmakers and critics could read English in the first place. They couldn't take the original in hand. Also, by shifting our analysis from, it helps us shift our analysis from simplistic notions of one-way influence to larger kinds of issues, such as the way that you can look at the sheer volume of translation and know a lot about the relationship between cultures, or the lack of translation and what that says about the relationship, or short circuits of desire. And when bringing text from one language to another, the translator's approach to language and to meaning is inseparable from larger historical and ideological currents in the target language. And this new linguistic and cultural context often bears pressure down on the original and the translation, while having little to do with the original text itself. So in this situation, where we actually end up with competing translations circulating amongst overlapping readerships and a struggle over authority over the text. Because after all, can there be a more powerful position over cross-cultural discourse than that of the translator? So I want to look at the qualities of a given translation, ask who the translator was, what's the translator's relationship to the original, the author, and the larger community of readers. And these are all key factors in the relationship to the other. And from this perspective, the difference between translation theory and documentary film theory seems slim, because both involves fields of representations weighed by a debt to original, whether it's the source text or the world. So let's look at how Rotha's book entered Japan and its film world. Originally, the first person apparently who picked up on this was Imamura Taihei, who we were talking about last night. Preeminent pre-war film theorist and critic. He passed it on to a producer at Domei Tsushin, Kuwano Shigeru, and from there it just surged into the documentary film community. At one point, it came into the hands of Atsugi Taka. Atsugi was one of the first female filmmakers after the one we heard about earlier today. She was one of the central members of the pro-Kino leftist collective. And then she went on to become an essayist and screenwriter. Now, above and beyond her own filmmaking activities, her most influential project was the translation that resulted in this book. She did this at the request of her supervisor at the studio at PCL, who was moving to JO to become head of production. He wanted to use this as a textbook for teaching how to do documentary in the studio, and to use it in study groups, essentially. Atsugi had been reading the original, and so she took on the project. It gave her a good excuse to finish it, she said. And it came out in the fall of 1938. The translation had enormous impact, and it went into second and third printings within the year. the book's influence quickly spread, and critics started debating what Rotha meant and the implications that he had for their filmmaking practice. And along the way, they started wondering about translation. They started really thinking about, you know, what words meant. And as they looked at the translation, they started debating whether it was good or not. And you started getting new translations, the most prominent being by a guy named Ueno Ichiro. Now, I was going to bring these in. In a series of essays, he does the first half of this book, one month after the other. It's in a magazine called Eiga Kenkyu, which has yet to reach the surface in the Makino Collection. It's in there somewhere. But Ueno also, a little bit later, published this. This was at the bequest of Toho and the Kyoto studio. And what it is the, oops. What it is the last part of the book. And what's amazing is it's mimeographed. It'll focus. It's a mimeographed copy. You know, so this was the textbook being used at Toho Film Studios, which became one of the most important producers of documentary film. And Ueno became also a participant in the debates in the press, along with his translations, both published publicly in that journal and then even privately in this textbook for Toho Film Studios. And the big debate, of course, was the relationship of fiction and documentary at this point when documentary was infiltrating the fiction film, and when they started writing scenarios for documentaries. And you see the two forms starting to come closer and closer together. So what happens, however, is relatively innocent-looking debates about actuality and fictionality were veiling struggles over documentary's function in Japanese society. Now, the written record on this, on these discussions is decidedly one-sided. Rotha was proposing a nationally sponsored documentary film committed to the enlightenment and the unification of the citizenry, precisely the kind of cinema necessary for a country involved in foreign warfare and trying to keep the nation state together, right? But under the restrictive circumstances of 1930s Japan, many other important perspectives went unrecorded and undebated, or they were surely happening off stage. This aspect of Rotha's appeal, especially his sympathies for socialism, necessarily had to be concealed from the public sphere, and they were restricted to private discussion. You don't really find it in the written record. And of course, this poses all sorts of challenges to a historian like me. But there are traces remaining, and I think they give us little entry points for thinking about other ways people were reading Rotha. And that's what I want to get into right now. First of all, like many other of the leftists that went underground and ended up in the documentary film world, Atsugi clearly found Rotha's writing inspirational. Here was a filmmaker who was committed to social change. Someone who saw the cinema as a medium for critiquing everything from class discrimination to totalitarian political systems. And having spent the last decade of her life immersed in Marxism and dedicated to using small gauge cinema to move the masses and bring the revolution, she found a true compatriot in Paul Rotha. Documentary film became this quote-unquote hidden sacred book of these filmmakers. This is a term that they used after the war to describe what it was like for them during the war. You can actually, I found one place where you can really sense in Atsugi's intense relationship with Rotha, and that was in her own copy of this book, which is deposited in the National Film Center. And when I opened it up, I found that there were 3 marginalia in the book, and that's it. Otherwise, it was a clean, beautiful new copy. And those 3 marginalia were dates put down in the summer of 1939, shortly after Kamefumio's fighting soldiers had been suppressed, when you know, a lot of weight was being felt by filmmakers in the documentary world. And these 3 quotes are fascinating, and I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'll read one of them. And you can sense a sort of pleasure in double reading, or finding an avenue to read Rotha against the grain, as it were. This is the Rotha quote that she quoted, that she wrote a date down in June 28, 1939. Relative freedom of expression for the views of the documentalist will obviously vary with the production forces he serves and the political system in power. In countries still maintaining a parliamentary system, discussion and projection of his beliefs within certain limits will be permitted only so long as they do not seriously oppose powerful vested interests, which most often happen to be the forces controlling production. Under an authoritarian system, freedom is permissible provided his opinions are in accord with those of the state for social and political advance, until presumably such a time shall arrive when the foundations of the state are strong enough to withstand criticism. Ultimately, of course, you will appreciate that you can neither make films on themes of your own choice nor apply treatments to accepted themes unless they are in sympathy with the aims of the dominant system. And in view of the mechanical and hence expensive materials of cinema, it will be foolish of the documentalist if his sympathies do not lie, or at least appear to lie, with those who can make production a possibility. I mean, you can just tell that for a leftist filmmaker making propaganda films for the war effort, that this was a very I mean, this was her life right there, encapsulated in a quote. And the other 2 places are very much like that as well. So this is one of these places that allow sort of access to more hidden spaces and resistant discourses. But this is only half the story. To render these kinds of discourses visible, I think we want to return to the problem of translation, because on the one hand, Atsugi weaved her point of view into the very fabric of the translation, both in conscious and in unconscious ways. At the very same time, intellectuals from far different perspectives were engaging her in a kind of battle of the translators. Now, in the course of researching my dissertation, which was when I encountered this stuff, and I was writing on the first 50 years of translation, I was collecting books. And everywhere I went, you know, I would go through all of the used bookstores, constantly going back and forth. And if I would even pick up books that I already had. And one of them was this one. And I remember in a bookstore between Waseda and Takanonowawa, I found this one. I pulled it down, and I picked it out of the slipcase, and I opened it up. And my jaw dropped. Because what I found was this. This is what I will call the Teiseiban, because this is what it looks like, what it looked like. See if I can get it focused. Every page, every single page is corrected. The entire book, front to back. And near the frontispiece, there's this text, which says, "This is a surprising book. She can't understand English. Japanese is pretty bad. Even Ms. Atsugi cannot argue with this. I don't understand how this person had the guts to translate it. This caused the chaos in this country's bunka eiga discourse. I'm sorry these corrections are a year late." So it took him a year to do this. And then there's this very interesting scrawl here. Now, I brought this back to Makino. Yeah, the next week, I had to show him. And I pulled it out and showed him my discovery. And he looked at it and was like, wow. After a few minutes of looking at this, his eyes were gleaming. And he closed it and said, "Can I have this?" And of course, as his porter, I could say nothing but, "Of course you can. As long as you give me your copy and the one with the really nice slipcase." And so we traded. We tried to make sense of this thing. Now, you notice that I brought in a Xerox copy. That's because we can't find it in the collection. So I'm assuming that Makino-san is watching this on video, and we're wondering if you kept it, maybe? So hopefully it will appear in a box some year. In any case, we could not figure out who did this because there were really no names until I was going through one of the many folders and the stacks of things that he gave me. And this was a bunch of programs from the Shinjuku Eiga Gekijo. And their programs are called Bunka Eiga News. You can see nice programs. A lot of these Japanese programs are wonderfully meaty. They've got text and articles. And then one time, I finally came across this one, which is, of course, the cover to the book, and a piece on Rotha's documentary film. And the beginning of this blew me away, because the very beginning of this essay says, "Below, let us pick out 2 or 3 parts of interest from a corrected text pretty much black with corrections." This is the guy who ordered the Teiseiban, And then when I saw this, and I immediately pulled out the Teiseiban. And of course, what this entire thing is a set of quotations from the Teiseiban, one after the other. And the author is Sekino Yoshio, who was involved in Monbusho, the Department of Education, and a lot of things for instance, children film days and things like this. And Sekino wrote a whole series of essays in other places, like this journal. All this is strings of new translations from the Teiseiban. But I am not going to bore you with the very close analysis I do of this, but essentially what I do, and if you really want to see it, you can go to Cinema Babel. It's a whole chapter in there on the translation of film theory. What I found in analyzing the Teiseiban, Sekino's translations, Atsugi's translations, and Ueno's translations was a battle over meaning and authority over Rotha, and by extension over documentary film itself. And Sekino was a bureaucrat, and he was essentially pulling it into the national project. And his quotations are very selective, and his transcriptions of the Teiseiban are themselves translations and interpretations, and sort of taking the Teiseiban, which is of all of the translations the best, and directing it towards the national project. Atsugi's is filled with mistakes, which, because the mistakes are still in the post-war versions, where she had help from even like film theorist Asanuma. Obviously she just didn't understand English well enough, but it's filled with her imaginative interpretations of what Rotha must have been saying as well. And you can see where her sympathies lies. And Ueno is kind of somewhere in the middle, very wishy-washy kinds of choices whenever anything political comes up. So this is essentially what I wanted to present to you, this kind of research that the Makino Collection makes possible. And it allows us to go and see, for instance, the Sekine films, which we heard about earlier today, were a mix of fictive and documentary kinds of styles, and understand exactly what, this is the world that she was embedded in. Those films look that way because of these kinds of debates and the ways that these translators were taking this foreign thought and massaging it, debating it, diverting it, subverting it, and everything else. I'll stop there. Thank you.